Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm focusing on an issue that we all intuitively understand and have probably wondered about. It's what's known as the bystander effect. The idea that when we find ourselves in crowds, we behave differently than we would on our own. So when you have lots of people who could, should and probably want to intervene in the situation, they're often less likely to do so than each individual would on their own. We're surrounded by examples of situations where lots of people know something, but no one does anything. You'll be familiar with the Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein cases, but you'll also recognise it from your own experience and, whisper it, your own behaviour. We all suffer from it. And it's that topic that Professor Catherine Sanderson tackles in her new book. If you're in the US, the book is called Why We Act, Turning Bystanders into Moral Rebels. If you're elsewhere, it's called the bystander effect, the psychology of courage and inaction. But either way, the book explores why good people often do nothing when a small intervention could make a big difference. As you'll discover, it doesn't have to be this way. Bystanders can learn to be brave. Catherine is the Manwell Family Professor of Life Sciences at Amherst College in Massachusetts, a state that is famous for standing up for its rights. We'll ignore the fact that I'm from the country they stood up to. Originally a psychologist, Catherine now specialises in studying aspects of human behaviour and social influence. In our discussion, we cover topics ranging from whistleblowing to social media. As you'll hear, the reason she wrote this book is extremely personal, something she explains early on in our discussion. I think you're going to find this fascinating, so please enjoy my discussion with Professor Catherine Sanderson. Catherine, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation to talk.
And look, it's my absolute pleasure to have you with me because your area of specialism, the bystander effect, has always fascinated me. And there's this famous story about Kitty Genovese, who was this lady that was murdered and lots of people were supposedly observed it and did nothing. And I, as I understand it, that story isn't actually true. But the dynamic that it exposes, we all recognize, right, where there's a sort of unwillingness to help. So I guess first question is, how did you get interested in this topic?
So I am a professor of social psychology. So of course, the bystander study is one that I learned about as an undergraduate. I learned about it as a graduate student. And it's something that I've, sort of loosely taught about, for years. But what really prompted me to write this book was an incident that happened just about 3 years ago now. My oldest child started college, and 2 weeks after he began, he called me and said, "Mom, a kid in my dorm died last night." And, as a parent, as a professor, it just struck me. And the story was one that's very familiar to everybody. The student was drinking, he fell, he hit his head. And then a group of his friends were very worried about him. So they watched over him to make sure he was still breathing. They strapped a backpack around his shoulders to make sure he wouldn't roll onto his back and vomit and choke to death. So they were worried. But what they didn't do was call for help. And they waited 19 hours before they called. Right. 19 hours before they called and got the kid medical attention. And by that point, it was too late. His family flew in from out of state to be with him when they disconnected him from life support. But the kid died. And all I could think about for really weeks and months after that was, these were nice kids. These were good kids starting college. And how could that have gone differently? So that, in all honesty, was what prompted me to really focus my attention on researching things that led to this book.
I mean, that is just on a personal level, incredibly you sort of emotionally driven, and I guess that's it's a sort of wonderful, terrible story, but an interesting example of how real life experiences can drive sort of academic passions. And I think it's a really sort of interesting entry point into that. And so as you sort of started to focus on that topic, I mean, what is the sort of summary of why do we not do things when there are other people around us?
So I will also just add that story, as you know, was a very personal example. But what also happened later that fall was the Harvey Weinstein, story came out about, again, all these people who didn't do anything. Reports continuing really throughout the world about sexual abuse by priests in the Catholic Church continue to come out. In the United States, the reports of the U.S. gymnastics doctor came out, and that no one had known for years. And so what was interesting to me as a mom, as a professor, was that those are really different examples, right? Harvey Weinstein, film producer, no one gets help. And then drunk kid in a college dorm, no one gets help. But what I became really interested in was precisely your question, that I really began to see all of those as driven by the same thing, that people recognize this isn't good, but people fail to take action. And there are a variety of different factors that lead us to do so. So I think, one clear example is that in some cases, we don't really know what's going on, that situations are ambiguous. So we've all seen someone who's drunk before. And I'm not suggesting every time we see a drunk person, we call the hospital, right? I mean, so it can be ambiguous. Is that person drunk, or are they really in trouble, medically? Many cases of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct can be a little bit ambiguous. You look really pretty, or that dress flatters your figure. Is that a nice compliment, or should I be offended? And so I think one issue is that we think of emergencies as being black and white. But the reality is, in many cases, problems aren't so clear, and that ambiguity makes it hard to act. I think another clear example, which you alluded to in the introduction today, is that there's an assumption that if we're with a lot of people, well, there's so many people who can help, I don't have to be the one. And that, in fact, was the theory initially around what happened with Kitty Genovese, was all of these witnesses, all of them could help. So I don't personally have to step up. So I think another factor that happens very clearly is that in group settings, each individual person says, yeah, there's a problem, but it's not my responsibility, because helping is complicated. And
there's a thread that you pick up in the book is the sort of embarrassment factor. So part of the reason we don't do stuff is because it would be embarrassing. And, I've seen you talk before about the very simple example. We all recognize where we're sat in meetings or in a lecture, and we don't ask the questions that we're itching to ask because we don't want to look dumb.
Absolutely. And that's something where, I'm an adult, and there are times when I've been in a meeting. I mean, so I'm not, a high school student asking to take a test on it. And I'm ashamed to say something. And so I think that I've talked before about situations are ambiguous. I've talked about a diffusion of responsibility, but another clear problem is that there are consequences of stepping up. And one of those consequences is social embarrassment. So we're in a classroom, we're at a meeting, we don't have any idea what's going on. And instead of saying, hey, I don't have any idea what's going on, we stay silent because we don't want to look stupid or feel embarrassed. We can also worry about the consequences. So I was struck in doing research for this book by a quote from actor-director Quentin Tarantino. And he was interviewed by the New York Times, and the New York Times said, did you know what was going on, with Harvey Weinstein all those years? And he said, I knew enough to do more than I did. And of course, what he did was nothing. What he did was nothing. so really, right? I knew enough. But that's the issue, is that people didn't call out Harvey Weinstein because he was really powerful. He was making or breaking careers. And as Ronan Farrow has reported, very clearly, people who called him out, people who reported him, suffered as a result of it. And so we can feel personal consequences. People aren't going to like me. People are going to think I'm stupid. But we can also very clearly feel professional consequences. I'm not going to get that promotion. I'm not going to get that, starring part in a movie or whatever. So there are lots of things that are natural social factors that inhibit us from taking action.
And so as I think about the evolution of the human species, obviously we are designed to operate in groups, right? And we kind of know this intuitively, and what we're going through at the moment with the bizarrely named social distancing, but physical distancing at least, is kind of testing that a little bit. So we know that we thrive better in groups for all the obvious reasons. And yet the dynamic that you have described suggests precisely the opposite. So the thing that we are driven towards, which is working together, collaborating with others, being in groups, actually doesn't help us do some of the right things. I'm intrigued by that kind of inherent contradiction.
Yeah, it's a really interesting contradiction. And what's especially key is that sometimes it helps us and sometimes it hurts us. So in some cases, we don't want to deviate from our group because we don't want to call out bad behavior. So for example, in fraternity hazing rituals or athletic teams or sometimes, corporate boards, right? People fail to call out bad behavior, even when it's absolutely fraudulent, when your colleagues are doing something that's not really right. So in one case, we really want to fit in. It's really important. And therefore, we can't speak out against group members because that's going to be a problem. In other cases, our connection to a group can actually lead us to help members of our group if they're in trouble. So people who say, oh, well, you're bullying my teammate and that's my teammate are actually more likely to step up and do something because they feel empathy and connection. So the group thing works both ways. Sometimes it leads us to stay quiet when we should act. And sometimes it actually gives us moral courage to be able to step up and do something.
And if we think about starting to deal with this, right? So, and the thing I love about this is it's a dynamic everybody recognizes. So you've beautifully brought some academic research into something that we just intuitively, we know from personal experience. And so what is it we can start to do to think about resolving that? I guess firstly on a personal level, and then when we think about sort of organizations.
Yeah, I love that question. And one of the reasons why I really have loved writing this book and talking about this book is that everybody identifies with it, as you just said. So I say, hey, I'm working on this project or I have this book coming out. And immediately somebody says, oh, that reminds me of the time I was in a dance, or, oh my gosh, this time I was in an airport, or I was in a hotel ballroom. And everyone has a story. And sometimes the story is, I wish I'd done something differently. And occasionally the story is, hey, I stood up and told that guy to shut up or, whatever. But I love that about it. But here's the thing. The book, in all honesty, is pretty depressing for a fair amount of it. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Right.
Right. I mean, because basically I'm saying these people didn't help and these people didn't help. And these people also didn't help. And there are all these examples. But I want to be very clear that the reason I wrote it was to help people do something different. And that is really what I'm hoping we'll get out of it as a personal level and a professional level. Not that, people are horrible human beings and, we're stuck. And so I do two things that I think are really important. In chapter 9, I describe, what are the traits of people who speak up? Who are those people? And what's interesting is that even in all of these examples, from Kitty Genovese and more recently, Harvey Weinstein, who are the people who stood up, the whistleblowers, and said, hey, this isn't good. This thing that's happening at Theranos, that's not good. This sexual assault that's happening at Stanford, that's not good. Who are these people who stood up and did something? Because I actually think understanding the characteristics and traits of people who step up, what I call the moral rebels, it's really important because that way we can learn from these people, what are their traits? And we can then try to build these traits within ourselves. But we can also really importantly try to instill them in our children. in people around them, we can prioritize them. So one thing is, what are the traits and how we can develop them? The other thing, which I do in the final chapter, chapter 10, is I talk about different strategies that we can use on a personal level, that we can use on an organizational level. And I do that because I think that what people need is a repertoire of different skills. Because the reality is that these situations are really different. You know, the case of seeing somebody taunted or teased or have racist slurs made on public transportation is very different from calling out a colleague who says something offensive in a meeting, is very different from raising your hand in the classroom and saying, hey, I don't understand what you're talking about. And so what I'm trying to do in chapter 10 is basically say, hey, here's something you could try. Here's something you could try. Here's what we know. Here's what we know, hoping that people will embrace this and then have this skill set where when they're in the situation, they won't have to think, oh, you know, in 24 hours, I'll have the perfect comeback, you know, to that moment, right? Which we've all had, right? Oh, in that moment, I wish I'd said this, or, oh, if I had only had the courage to do this. What I want is to give people a sense of, here are the things I know. And this way I can use it and I can have different skills that will fit different situations. And that's what I'm hoping people will get from it to be able to change the world.
And I mean, speaking of the world, are there different cultural norms that would lead? I mean, I think the answer to this is yes, but I'll ask it anyway, that lead people to behave differently. So if I think about very compliant cultures like Japan, for example, I'm assuming that the way this thing plays out there is very different to the way it might play out in, say, the US or the UK?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. There's in all honesty, not an adequate amount of research that does that sort of high quality cultural comparison in that way. But there is certainly evidence that in certain cultures, speaking up against the group is seen as more problematic. I give an example in my social psychology class that in Western cultures, there's often the expression, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, which of course is, you know, be a pain in the ass, right? I mean, that's right, more or less. And in many Asian cultures, there's another expression, which is the peg that stands out gets pounded down. And that's really don't deviate, right? Don't deviate in that sense. And so I do think there are probably broad cultural norms, but there are also really interesting sub-norms. So in different cultures within the UK or within the US, there may be differences in terms of how much we value or don't value speaking out. We certainly know that across, I believe, all cultures at a neurological level, teenagers, young adults, really, really fear standing out and deviating from their group. And so there also may be differences that occur across the lifespan. I
was struck as you were talking about that, there's that story about the Korean airliner where nobody wanted to challenge the pilot. And so the unfortunate ending occurred. And I think there's a sort of interesting example. But, you know, as I look at society as a whole, I mean, one of the interesting things is that as we face the sort of crises we're facing at the moment, and I don't just mean the virus, but everything else, you know, we need a diversity of voices to speak up and to kind of bring new perspectives. And we can see that in the benefits of, if I look back to the financial, why was there the financial crisis? Well, strangely enough, there's a load of people that are slightly older versions of me sitting around a table having very collective, homogenized thoughts. And so there's lots of examples where diversity helps us. And so as a society, we kind of need to grab this in order to solve some of the complex problems that we have. And so if this is ingrained, we're facing quite a big societal challenge if this is in our DNA.
Absolutely. And I think your example of the importance of having a diversity of voices is true across multiple levels. An example that ended up not making the final cut of the book, just in terms of organization and space, was I had talked initially about what happened with the Challenger space shuttle explosion within the United States, 20 or so years ago now. And in that case, there were clearly signs that there were real problems with the O-rings in the space shuttle that could lead it to, in fact, catch on fire and explode. And engineers kind of kept saying, hey, there's a problem. Hey, there's a problem. We need to be worried. And the management, who was really keen to, send an elementary school teacher into space for the first time, they said, take off your engineering hats and put on your marketing hats. Now, I think you never want anyone to take off their engineering hat, right? I mean, I think that you want
it's not good advice, right?
Not good advice ever. Like building a bridge, whatever, building the damn engineering hat on very strongly, because I think that's exactly the point. And I think that one of the things that we need to understand as a society that we really, really do need diverse voices, but we also need to hear the diverse voices, right? That we can't just say, shut up. And we can't have a situation where people have opinions and are not willing to raise them. That we actually all benefit as a society if there are critiques and ideas are vigorously challenged, because that's going to help us ultimately make better decisions. And in some cases, life-saving decisions.
And if I look at social media, I mean, there's an interesting dynamic here where everybody has the ability to speak up, and that is used by various people for various ends, both good and bad. Have you sort of looked into that dynamic and what that means for, echo chambers and shutting people out and those sorts of dynamics?
Well, so one of the big problems, and I talk about this in the first chapter of the book, one of the big problems is that anonymity makes it really easy to engage in bad behavior. And lots of people on social media are actually anonymous. People have Twitter handles that are not actually linked with their name, their bio, their photo, et cetera. And so one of the problems is that in some cases on social media, you see this with cyberbullying, that people are not even actually owning their own words. And I think that's a really big problem. I think another issue is that it becomes very easy on social media for somebody to raise something, a concern, a critique, and then all of a sudden people just attack that person. And that can lead to dissenting voices really feeling like they can't speak out. And that in turn can be really consequential. So I think social media really should have the potential of letting us hear and be exposed to a range of voices. It should have that potential, but we often don't live up to that reality.
And that kind of pile-on is interesting, because it's sort of, again, it's us and not acting in our collective best interests. And so I find it a sort of fascinating dynamic, which is, if I look at it from the perspective of the group, we just want everything to be homogenized and straightforward, and therefore it's almost that model, as you were saying, of the nail that gets hit down. Is that what's at play there, or? Well,
I mean, we often probably, even at an evolutionary level, depend on our groups, right? Groups help us survive. There really is a sense of survival is advantage when we're not just sort of out for the individual. And so in many cases, being part of a group, a social network, a tribe is really advantageous. That should help us survive. And we see examples of that throughout history, people looking out for one another. The problem is that in some cases, it can actually have this really negative consequence, because it can lead us to be hesitant about calling out a group member. I describe a story in the book that really struck me as a professor. I had a student, very good student, who was on the basketball team. And he was in my office one day and said, and I was talking about this book that I was working on, and he said, "It's so interesting because every day when I'm in the basketball locker room, someone says something offensive. And I speak up and sometimes I don't." But so he absolutely understood. He was totally aware that what he was hearing was offensive. He wasn't seeing it as, inconsequential. But he was also very aware that sometimes he spoke up and sometimes he didn't. And that to me was such an important point, that he had this awareness, and yet he also didn't always feel comfortable speaking up against his group of team members. But what also struck me is it's distinctly possible that all those times that he didn't speak up, most other people sitting in that locker room also felt exactly the same as he did. And yet they did not speak up. And that's so interesting, because I think we can all think of times in which we've been in meetings and we've said, ooh, that really, isn't good, or I don't really agree, but we have not spoken up. And in some cases, of course, on juries or boardrooms, this can lead to really bad decision making, but we just often fear speaking up against our group. And I think, frankly, shifting our culture so that we understand that speaking up in a group and deviating is a good thing. It's a good thing for group outcomes. It's not rejecting group members or saying other people are stupid, and that we need to sort of have a shift in our culture in which we embrace and understand deviant opinions so that they actually get heard and understood.
That's fascinating, because I was just thinking about what I sort of refer to as the after party for meetings, where you come out of the meeting and then you have that discussion that really should have taken place in the room. And it's almost like you have to have that discussion to kind of cathartically cleanse what you know you've done is wrong. So I think that's a really interesting observation, sort of with that thought process in mind of corporate constructs that don't help this. What are your thoughts on sort of organizations? Because as we look at the need for organizations to evolve and survive crises like we've got at the moment, we need to have innovation, which comes with trial and error. We need to have people speaking up to call stuff out. And we need to have a diversity so that we don't go metaphorically crash the business because we follow a poor strategy or have a dominant CEO. How can businesses start to think about some of these dynamics?
So what's very interesting, and I actually talk about this length for your listeners who are particularly interested in that topic in chapter 8, in which I talk about how all these things play out in the workplace. And I'll say that some of the earliest work that looked at precisely the question that you're asking occurred in 2 domains. And I don't think that this is accidental. So one was actually airlines. There were a number of cases, and you alluded to the example before of the Korean airliner. There were a number of cases that occurred in the United States in the sort of 1970s in which planes crashed because pilots made bad decisions and co-pilots didn't call them out because there was this sense of hierarchy. So in one case, a plane literally ran out of gas. That's literally what happened. And that's a case in which there were co-pilots who were concerned but didn't say anything. And so there was actually a whole renovation within the airline industry to try to say, hey, we need to empower co-pilots to challenge pilots, and we need to change the sort of shift of hierarchy. And so there was a book written that I refer to again in chapter 8 that describes how the airline industry really rethought this corporate model because they were literally killing people. And of course, that was very costly for the airlines in terms of lawsuits and lost planes and pilots and so on. The other area in which it happened earlier was in the medical profession, in which, again, you have this phenomenon of doctors making bad decisions and other people in an operating room, nurses and so on, lower power position people, not calling out bad behavior. And so many hospital settings have started to say, we need to shift this culture to develop, in fact, moral courage so that people who are lower on the hierarchy will feel comfortable voicing their opinions. And so those 2 examples, I think, are not accidental because those are cases of literal life and death. Making a bad decision in a cockpit or in an operating room literally can kill a person or lots of people. And so we can take those lessons and we can apply them to any sort of business organization. We can apply them to political environments. We can apply them to corporate boards. We can apply them to university administrations and so on, that those exact same lessons, which are really all about how do we give people the courage to speak up and do the right thing, even when it can feel very hard. And that really requires a shift in culture so that we hear voices, that we understand the importance and the value of hearing those diverse opinions. And that does require a culture shift.
One of the ways that I see organizations trying to solve this is to build structures that are designed to look like they are solving the problem. So whistleblower hotline would be a good example, right? So I want whistleblowers, and I will demonstrate to everybody that we take this very seriously because we've paid for an independent company to run a whistleblower hotline. So logical solution to problem. But from a practical perspective, I think that sends the opposite signal, which is we feel the need to have this thing because actually our standard processes don't pick this stuff up. And we've probably been told we need to have it. And of course, it's sensible to have it as a sort of backstop position. But if that's your only approach to solving the problem, you're actually sending exactly the opposite signal, which is things are so bad that we have to put this structure in place and we're cleaving everything on that structure.
Well, yeah. And I would say basically saying we know that people won't be comfortable reporting it directly. So we need to have this other hotline because we know that we'll fire you if you actually report it and I know who you are, right?
Right.
Another point, and this is not my line, but this comes from another book that I describe in chapter 8, which is that one of the problems is the name whistleblower, because whistleblower sounds bad. What's a whistleblower? Well, it's like a referee or an umpire. It's somebody that we don't like, who's calling out the rules and interrupting the game. And it's really pejorative. And so again, this is from Jeffrey Wigand, who was the whistleblower, within the tobacco industry a long time ago, describing the extent to which they were really manipulating levels of nicotine to create addiction. And he says, we need to change the name and we should call whistleblowing person of conscience. So person of conscience. And that, again, boy, that's a totally different thing, because that's flipping the frame and describing these people as moral rebels, as doing the right thing, not as whistleblowers.
I love that. Actually, your example of referee and umpire is interesting, because they are clearly not on your team.
No, never. Right? and that's the whistleblower. That's the whistleblower.
So these corporate solutions that we see being rolled out across the piece, as you say, they're badly named, they are badly executed, and they're compensating for the basic cultural piece. How do you so if organizations want to take that step of actually dealing with the issue rather than just box ticking? I mean, what are your thoughts on how they should even start to go about that?
So I'm going to talk about something really high and then something really low. And believe you me, there's lots of stuff in the middle, but I'm going to give you sort of the two extremes. Mm-hmm. So on one extreme, and this is hard, you got to hire ethical people. Because if a leader of a company, an organization, is engaging in fraudulent behavior, it just trickles down. It's impossible for people reporting to that person to engage in ethical behavior if they're looking at that person, spending money poorly, making bad decisions, embezzling, whatever. And so if the leader of an organization is not committed to ethical behavior for him or herself, it just trickles down and creates a really bad culture. And so in all honesty, boards, universities, and so on, they need to have people at the very top who are saying not just, yeah, let's be ethical, but they're actually walking the walk. They're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk. And so that means they need to demonstrate ethical decision-making and moral reasoning at the highest level. And so that's something that, when companies think about who they're hiring or who they're putting on a board or who is the CEO or president, they may think about, well, how successful has that person been, in their prior business, or how much money did they raise, or whatever the criteria are. They often don't think, is this person really a moral leader? Is this person really known for making sometimes hard decisions that are ethically the right ones? And so I think companies need to prioritize. We're not just going to say who is the most famous or the highest profile, but let's look at their track record specifically of making moral decisions. So I think at the very highest level, you really do got to start with the top. Now, I want to turn now to the tiniest, lowest example. And this is actually done at a university in the UK. It's a real story. It's a research study, but it's a real story. And what they had in this psychology department was they had something that we've all probably seen in offices, where you have a kitchen in the office and there's a coffee pot and there's a sign that says, put in some money every time you have some coffee. Here's the price. And of course, people tend to I'm out of change today. I'll put it in, I only had a small cup, whatever. And so people tended to under put in their coffee. So this is all they did. For 1 week, right above the sign where it said, put in the money, they had a pair of eyes. So when you went to put in your money, you were looking at, in fact, a pair of eyes, the idea that somebody's watching you. In other weeks, they had just a picture of a flower. So again, a pretty picture, but nothing. And what they found was simply having the eyes up there led people to put in more money. And so that's a tiny change in the environment in which what you're doing is making people more self-aware. And what research tells us time and time again is that most of us like to think of ourselves as good people. We like to think of ourselves as people who would do the right thing, who make morally good decisions, who behave in moral ways. But the challenge is we often lose a sense of who we are. And so any kind of manipulation that increases self-awareness tends to lead us to act in more moral ways. So looking at ourselves in a mirror while we decide how much money we're going to put in tends to increase how much we put in. Having a pair of eyes. I'm a college professor. Lots of research has shown that having students sign a pledge saying, I have not cheated, I have not given help or received help on this exam, decreases rates of cheating if that happens before they take the exam. So you want to have them sign before they take it. Research has shown that automobile insurance companies have people write, I will honestly report the mileage on my car before filling out the form, actually have people reporting higher levels of mileage driven than if they don't ask people to make that report initially. So anything we can do to increase self-awareness actually leads to better behavior.
And I think both of those extremities are interesting because when I look at the senior level piece, it's fascinating to me how many organizations hire people, particularly at the very, very senior levels, who are well known, or at least whose backgrounds you could easily check out. And they hire these people who've got some kind of interesting dynamic in their past or some interesting dynamic in their private life. And there's this presumption that we'll hire them because they're typically in banking, it's rainmakers, but you get sort of similar dynamics elsewhere, rock stars kind of thing. There's an implicit presumption that somehow, we know all of this stuff, but we'll ignore that. And somehow them coming into our little bubble is going to change the way they behave. And clearly that's nonsense. And it doesn't surprise us to see that later down the line, two things happen. One is you get the cognitive dissonance of expecting someone who's a little bit immoral and clearly publicly known to start making statements about morality and ethics doesn't go down well. But the second thing is they behave exactly in the way you expect them to. And I find this hiring question interesting. And then the second bit that struck me as you were talking was around the small interventions. I think that's very interesting because the architect is back to the environment matters and the architecture matters. But what I see is organizations failing to do both of those things. I mean, there's simple things you've said, but they fail on both levels. And the architecture one is really simple. So it's your idea about the eyes is a very simple piece. And as you say, getting someone to attest before they do. There's no point in asking someone to attest whether they've been complaining with it after they've done it, because the likelihood of them admitting it. So I look at these things and go, this is common sense, and yet it doesn't happen. And I'm intrigued as to why.
Well, so I think part of the issue is that people have. I mean, your example just before. Businesses hire somebody with maybe a little bit of some red flags, but they say, but it'll be different now. It'll be different here, right? I mean, and that's a sort of assumption that, in this environment, things will in fact go differently. And, for years, of course, that's how sexual misconduct continued within lots of, religious organizations, within, famous TV studios and so on, is the assumption, maybe, that person's over it now, or maybe that won't happen again. But I think really having a clear sense that when you are evaluating whether somebody is going to be a good fit as the moral leader for your organization, you actually have to say, do we value this? And I think one of the issues is that organizations often value lots of different things, but they often don't value that moral leadership role. And I think one of the key things that companies need to understand is that if the person in charge is not a moral leader, is not making morally good decisions, that trickles down and it absolutely hurts the rest of the company, because everybody who works under that person is going to take the same sort of shortcuts and ethical poor decision making. It just trickles down. And so I think understanding, obviously businesses are in a business to make profit. That's the goal. It's not to be, a nonprofit, Robin Hood sort of thing. It's very much to increase wealth. But the key is understanding if you hire somebody who's really famous, but has these ethical problems, that is going to invade the entire corporate culture, because it looks absolutely hypocritical for that person to then call out bad behavior by other people, right? If they're doing it themselves. And that can be, making ridiculous travel expenses. It can be making poor decisions in their personal life that, then impact the company's reputation. There can be lots of different factors. But I think understanding that if there's bad decision making at the top, it trickles down and ultimately, maybe not immediately, But ultimately, it's very, very costly for the company because it invades the entire culture, and it really can shift a culture's reputation very, very fast. And that can occur, of course, in lots of different settings. So understanding that it may seem like a good short-term solution to hire this sort of famous rainmaker, but what are the long-term implications? That the companies are not trying to make a profit over a year or two. They're trying to be sustainable for a very, very long time frame.
And it's interesting when you were talking there about the sort of longer term consequences. And, we see it when these things go wrong, where a toxic individual is hired and then it plays out exactly the way you'd expect it to play out. And then people kind of go, oh, yeah, we sort of knew. And as you were talking earlier around some of the sort of bystander piece, I wish I'd said this. I wish I'd done that. So we kind of know, and we kind of park that piece, but we know it's going to come back to haunt us at some point. There's a reckoning to be had. And of course, some of the ethical things you were talking about, there's the short-term gain, potentially a spike in the share price to help the quarterly reporting. But we kind of intuitively know there's long-term pain here if this goes potentially the way it could go. And we don't seem to learn from that.
Well, I think one of the challenges is that there's sort of the human tendency to say, well, this time things will be different, right? We can read every February 1st about all the New Year's resolutions that have faded. This is the year that I'm going to lose 10 pounds and also run a marathon and also stop smoking, or whatever it is. So, we can see that, right? Every New Year's Eve, here I am, here are my resolutions, right? We've all made them. And so I think the challenge is that we can have these high-minded ideas. This year I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. But here's the difference. And again, what I'm hoping my book gives people the strategies to do is that what you need is not just understanding, oh yes, things, should go different or things might go the same. How do we make specific steps? So what do we do differently moving forward? And how do we prioritize? So there's a wonderful checklist that is now used in many, many hospitals that is really credited with saving lives. And what that checklist does is it says, here are all of the steps that we need to take in order to keep patients safe. And that can include, did everybody wash their hands when they came in the room? Did we make sure that we put on a fresh pair of gloves? Did we make sure, we wipe down the, scalpel, whatever it is? And that's an example if there's literally a checklist to make sure all of these things have happened. It's exactly what happens in cockpits before a plane takes off. Have we checked that there's enough fuel? Have we checked that, the tires are in good shape? Have we checked, these different things? And that's really the key, is that organizations have to decide, do we really value moral leadership? Do we really value that? And if we really value it, we need to hire based on it. And we need to say, okay, we may not see the instant, profit windfall, but we're going to keep going in this direction because we value making good decisions and we recognize that there is a long-term payoff. And the reality is we can flip it. It's extraordinarily costly when companies hire somebody who is a problematic leader, right? We can see examples in which people have paid off people, $18 million, to Bill O'Reilly, for Fox News to not actually report on Fox News, or paid off, football coaches or whatever because they've done something really horrible. And so it's very, very costly. The Catholic Church is settling tons and tons of lawsuits because these priests were passed around from parish to parish and continued to engage in inappropriate sexual molestation of kids. And so here's the thing. When bad behavior continues, it's extraordinarily costly. I talk in the book about Theranos, the, miracle blood testing company, that actually, of course, was totally fraudulent and led to lots of people who invested in that company losing tons of money. Bernie Madoff's, Ponzi scheme is another example. That the reality is that in the short term, investing in those companies, Theranos or Madoff, seemed like a really good idea. And then it went really, really poorly.
And all of that driven by this optimism bias, right? That we want to believe, as you say, we want to believe things will be different. We almost ignore the evidence that's before us. and we find reasons why what we see. So to the extent that there is clear evidence, and I recognize you've talked about ambiguous situations where we can interpret it conveniently, possibly, to help us make a decision that we don't have to do anything. There's this other piece that sort of says, well, it'll be all's well that ends well, and I can kind of kick the can down the road for my need to speak up now because it's probably going to be okay, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and I actually think that perfectly illustrates another phenomenon that you and I have not talked about, but which is so relevant to this, which is the slippery slope effect. Because often what happens, let's say you hire somebody and you think that person is great, you've done your due diligence, that person seems awesome. Then the question is, what happens when there's a little bit of bad behavior? Do you call out that bad behavior or do you not? And one of the challenges is that people often initially, because it's ambiguous, because we're not really sure what's going on, they don't call out bad behavior initially. So initially it's like, well, the profits weren't quite what we thought they'd be this quarter, but we're very confident of that sale that we're going to have in April. So we're going to just fudge it a little now because it's all going to work out and then no one will know and it'll all be fine. And so you do a little bit of a fudging of something initially, and that's no big deal. And then, of course, once you've taken a step down that road, it becomes very hard. So another factor I think that very commonly happens in organizations of all types is we ignore little things. And then once we've ignored those little things, it becomes harder and harder to speak up because we also then have to say, well, why didn't I speak up earlier? And so in the final chapter of the book, I have some advice, and here's the advice. Sweat the small stuff. Sweat the small stuff. It becomes very easy to say, well, that's just a little thing. That's just something minor. I'm not going to worry about it. But the reality is when we don't sweat the small stuff, we get what many people have described as the boiling frog in boiling water effect, right?
I really hope no one's ever actually done that.
I really do.
Because it's this well-known thing for listeners that aren't aware. It's this basic idea that if you put a frog into boiling water, it'll jump out. If you put it into cold water and slowly heat the water up, it doesn't notice and dies. I mean, it's a lovely visual, but it's hideous from a kind of, who the hell came up with that?
Well, and it's hideous on both ends, right? It's hideous on dropping the frog into boiling water. It's also hideous dropping the frog into cold water and then heating it up. Like they're both
right.
So bad. So no recommendation on either of those. But I think it really speaks to the importance of saying, don't overlook the small stuff. That in many cases of all sorts, hazing on an athletic team or fraternity, sexual misconduct, corporate fraud, it doesn't happen big initially. It happens little. It happens little, tiny, escalating steps. And that makes it very hard for people to call out the behavior because they've let so much slide. So call out the small stuff so that it doesn't escalate. And when you don't call out the small stuff, it conveys, I'm going to overlook the small stuff, which conveys to other people in an organization, yeah, we overlook the small stuff, which then leads people to escalate their behavior because they weren't called out for bad behavior when it was pretty low level. And then it just continues.
And that's interesting. So there's a counter argument I'd put to you on this thing, which I'd be interested to get your views on. So what we've seen, and this is a financial services piece where you have, for example, a rogue trader. And one of the things that has been identified with hindsight is that there were lots of early signals, to your point, that of small things they were doing, which if you had looked at them in totality, you'd be going, whoa, there's a problem here. And so maybe it was they were coming in working funny times of the day. They never took vacation. Their expenses were slightly out of line. They didn't do their training on time. Load of little indicators, which, as you rightly point out, if you're not on top of these things, with hindsight, it's very easy to see that there's a pattern here. But one of the interesting things I saw happen as I was a regulator at many organizations that had kind of problems is that what they then did was they said, okay, we need to monitor all of this stuff. So we're going to look at all the metrics we can, and we're going to give managers information on the people that report to them so that they can supervise and go to where you want. And what's interesting about that was that you end up then in a world where people are criminalized for small mistakes. Because people are going, I need to watch the really small stuff, and any small step out of line is illustrative of the fact they are going to be one of those bad people. And so you ended up with a criminalization of very small offenses where, and I don't mean things like expense fraud. I mean kind of, just sort of slightly late on something. And so you end up with this thing where anybody who had made the slightest error would sort of sit there and go, well, I'm in trouble now. I've now been treated like it's broken windows policing, if you like, from an intern. And so you'd have this flip side thing where people go, the smallest thing. So nobody's allowed to make any mistakes whatsoever, which is kind of a terrible piece. And it's an interesting dynamic to have to square, because I agree with you entirely. If you let people go, we all know this. You get away with a small thing, you do more and more and more of it. But equally, if you're not allowed to make mistakes, and maybe the answer is in what you're tracking, then also you've got a problem because people hide stuff quickly as well.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of key things in what you said, and I agree that it is complex. So one is, and we've talked about this earlier, you really got to hire well, right? because if you hire well, you then don't have to worry about people sort of saying, this escalating thing, because you've hired people who just are not going to be at risk of doing that thing. I think the other thing, though, is there's a difference between saying you're in trouble for being late on this or, whatever, and saying, hey, just checking in, we noticed. And I think that's the key, is it's not saying, you did this, you're fired. You did this, it's, whatever, your pay is docked or, whatever. But I think it's saying we noticed this, just checking in. Because that illustrates that the organization actually cares. The organization cares that expense reports are filed on time. The organization cares if expenses are over what they should be. The organization is noticing, because in many cases, if you don't call it out, the assumption is, oh, nobody noticed. Nobody was actually aware that this was happening. So, I expense reported, a really, really expensive bottle of wine. Nobody noticed. This is great. Next time maybe I'll get one to take home, from the trip as well, in that sense. And so there's an example in which if you have a sense that nobody in fact noticed, there's also the sense that, no one cares. And that's what leads. So it doesn't mean calling out somebody, hey, your dinner, went over by this amount, you need to pay us. But it's saying like, hey, just checking in, making sure you understand, kind of watch this in the future. That conveys that the organization cares. The organization cares. The organization has a fiscal responsibility to shareholders to be using money wisely. And that in turn conveys that this is something that we notice, because often people have the sense that no one noticed. And that, in fact, is what plays out with the I don't raise my hand in a meeting, right? I don't raise my hand in a meeting because I don't want to look stupid. That's the same factor of assuming then the people who continue to say, everybody must have agreed with them because nobody called them out. So your comment before was the, what did you call it? The after party? I love that expression. Yeah. The after party. So there's a case in which people say things at meetings, other people disagree, but they don't speak up then. They do it in the after party. The people who spoke up at the meeting then assume by the silence, because they're not at the after party, that everybody agreed. Same thing. If somebody files wrong expense reports, somebody is late on things, somebody doesn't do their training, et cetera, and no one says anything, they assume, oh, this company doesn't really care if I get things in on time, if my expense reports are late, if my expense reports are too high, if I don't do the training. Lack of calling somebody out for it and not firing them, but just saying, hey, we noticed, conveys this is not a company that cares. Silence typically indicates agreement. And that's true in lots of different settings.
That kind of neatly pulls together, I think, one of the key themes that sort of, I've took from the book, which was this idea that we don't know why other people are doing things, and whether that's individuals or groups or organizations. And so that lack of feedback loop means that we impute our own interpretation on things. And that for me was the biggest piece there. And I think in a world where, we sort of are just judging on actions, we're not getting that insight, we're likely to come to the wrong conclusion.
Yes. And what I like about that conclusion, which I fully agree with, it really sort of encapsulates the book, is that exact same dynamic plays out everywhere. So that dynamic explains why you have the after party after the meeting because nobody spoke up. It explains why you don't call out your, racist or homophobic uncle for a comment that he makes, around the, dinner table at Christmas Eve or whatever. It plays out why my basketball player stayed silent in the locker room when his teammates said offensive things, and it explains lots of different behavior. But again, the key is that we all assume it's only us. But in many cases, actually, it's everyone around us is also thinking the same thing we're thinking, but we're all inhibited in precisely the same way from calling things out. And what my own research has shown and what I describe in the book is that understanding that psychology, understanding, hey, I didn't say anything because I didn't want to look embarrassed, but you know what? I bet all these other people at the meeting, in the locker room, whatever, felt the same as I did. That's what's so powerful, is that understanding the psychology that leads us to not act helps us feel more connected to other people, because it helps us understand that the exact same fears of embarrassment and inhibition and anxiety might well have been driving everybody else's behavior as well. And that can help us overcome the forces that lead us to stay silent and can lead us to actually speak up.
That, I think, is a wonderful note on which to finish. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's been revelatory. The book, which I'll put details in the show notes, is out now and comes clearly highly recommended. I tend not to invite people onto the podcast whose books I'm not recommending. But thank you so much for your words of wisdom and insight, because I think it's something that's useful to all of us, both personally and in our work life.
Well, thank you so much. As I think you can tell, the work is really personally meaningful to me. And I'm really hoping, perhaps optimistically, that people read it and really take it to heart, personally and professionally, and that all of us together can change the world.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Catherine for coming onto the show and being such a great guest. If you're interested in her book, you'll find details of that in the show notes. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk Podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. If, when you're on that platform, you had a moment to leave a review, that would be hugely helpful. It keeps the profile of the show up, which allows me to continue to attract the kind of high-quality guests I've managed so far. It also allows other people to find the show. And let's face it, that's a nice thing to do. All that remains for me now is to say thank you so much for listening. I'll see you very soon on another episode. I'm releasing them more frequently than I would normally for obvious reasons. And to say thank you so much for listening. Stay safe and take care.